That was 30 seconds. Isn't it amazing? Silence. Silence for 30 seconds. So what went through your mind in those 30 seconds? Something wrong? Waiting for something? Has Father Todd forgotten what he's doing? Any of those things could be true. But it's fascinating, really, that so much can be happening inside of us when nothing's happening. Isn't it? So there are no words, nothing happening, and yet we rush, the insides of us rush to fill in the space. And you know that experience. I mean, it's almost a daily experience when you meet somebody who is new to you, or somebody you really wanted to meet, and all of a sudden things are awkward, and you're trying to figure out the right way to say something, and these moments of silence feel very, very uncomfortable. This question of what do we do when there is no sound to distract us? So oftentimes what we do is we fill the space. So we fill it with clatter. We fill it with kind of the background noise of chatter that oftentimes has no meaning except to cover over the voices and the discomfort of the quiet. And so we know that when there are no voices, when nothing happens, there is a lot happening. We just don't perceive it. And so we know that oftentimes in the quiet, in the dark, there are people who, for instance, are victimized. People who are taken advantage of by others. We've gone through a decade of learning about sexual misconduct and sexual abuse that has happened within the Roman Catholic Church and within the Episcopal Church and virtually every denomination across the board, in universities and in the Boy Scouts of America, and numbers of places where those who have been young and voiceless have been victimized, and no one has heard their voices. In fact, they've been told to be silent. But when silence comes, then we fill the air with all of the misdirection and all of the sounds to somehow not pay attention to it. But the silence will have out. As Jesus said, what is whispered in the house will be shouted from the rooftop. And so the voices of the victims, whether of sexual abuse or poverty, racial discrimination, you name it, the victims' voices will be heard. And those of good heart and good conscience will hear them. Underneath all of the clatter around us, we'll hear them, and their voice will speak loud. Psychologists tell us that we are uncomfortable with silence because there are so many voices inside of us. Voices of discomfort, voices of fear, memories of past hurts, things that we have done and left undone, our guilt, pains, doubts, fears. All of those voices clamor inside of us when we hear nothing outside of us. And so that's why to sit in silence, in absolute silence, is almost for us as human beings unendurable. John Cage, the iconoclastic American composer, had back in the 1940s and 50s got just frustrated with the shallowness of American music. And so in 1953, he composed and performed what he called 433. People paid to come to his concert and to hear it performed. It was 4 minutes and 33 seconds of constant rests. You could play it on any instrument because not a note was sounded. An entire orchestra could play it and be in tune with each other. People excoriated him. 3 movements of silence. They said, well, this is the stupidest thing in the world. There's no sound. And he said, really? Did you hear it? The sound of the taxi cab that was outside the building. The sound of the guy 3 rows back who coughed. The rustle of nervousness with the programs. The sound of the beating of your heart. And the voices inside of you. So silence doesn't mean that nothing's happening. There can be a lot that's happening. Scholars call the period of time that we are in within the kind of the liturgical calendar, just at the very end of 400 silent years. The 400 years of silence from the end of the last of the prophets, Malachi, until the opening of the Gospels. 400 years of silence. So of course, not silence from things happening. So when you go back to Malachi, the last of the prophets, and you look at what was happening with the people of God, they were an intact people who were united against the Persians, who were their occupying force. And over those 400 years, the temple itself had been ransacked any number of times. The Persians who had been there were kicked out by the Greeks, and then finally by the Romans, who were there by the time Jesus arrived. There was no king among the people of Israel, but there was a king all of a sudden in the Gospels. They were united as a people at the end of the Old Testament, but with the beginning of the New Testament, people were factionalized into parties. And so we see the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Herodians and the Essenes, all political parties vying for who it was that was right. Oh, there was a lot that had happened during those 400 years. What was silent was the voice of God. Where was it that God was speaking? But Jesus tells us in the gospel lesson, he says, consider the fig tree. So when you look to the fig tree, you see that the time comes when, although it looks dead, suddenly the limbs, the twigs become tender, and the leaves begin to sprout, and you know that summer is coming. Summer with all of its lush vegetation and the sweet fruit that it brings. In silence, growth happens, preparation happens for the great feast that is to come. And so for us, that growth happens in silence. The spiritual writers tell us that the disciplines of solitude and silence are the very bedrock of all of the other disciplines. Without them, the reading of Scripture is just words on a page, and prayers are just prattle. It is in silence that we hear the voice of God. But it's not easy, nor oftentimes is it pleasant. I remember probably about 20 years ago now, sitting in silence on a southwest plane that took me to Michigan. We had been following my mother's progress since she'd been diagnosed with cancer. It was first kidney cancer, and then became bladder cancer, and then metastasized into her bones. It was very painful for her. And it was over a period of months that she went through any number of treatments. And then finally, we came to the place of realizing that none of these treatments were going to see her through. And so attention became trying to contain the pain that she was experiencing. And so I got a phone call that she really didn't have much time left, probably about a week. It turned into about a month. And so I got on a plane to go and be with her and to help spell my brother and my sister who were there and who had been kind of going around the clock providing care for her. When I got there, it was obvious that they were pretty haggard and needed some relief. But I dreaded it. Not that I didn't love my mother, I loved her deeply, but because I loved her, I dreaded it. I dreaded not the times when other people would be around and it was the light of day and we could distract ourselves with the stuff, but I dreaded the nights when I would be there alone with her. I slept on a couch next to her bed, and it was in the night that oftentimes the pain would be the most difficult. And so I learned, I didn't know that before, but I learned what it meant to manage her pain medication so she would be as comfortable as possible. And I learned what it meant to swab her mouth because her lips would become chapped and stuck. I learned what it meant to clear her catheter when it became clogged. I didn't know that I would need ever to know how to do that on my mother, but she coached me through it. It was in the silence of those long nights that then in her lucid times, we would talk, and when we ran out of things to talk about, we'd just read Scripture together and pray for her to see her through her pain. And remember to tell stories about what it was like to grow up and to laugh together during that time. I dreaded those nights and the silence that they brought. It never occurred to me that in those moments I would experience a level and depth of gentleness, of compassion coming from my mother as well as from me to her, of love and peace. I never would have dreamed I would experience those things and not just read them from a book or have someone else tell me about them. I never thought that I would experience a level of love and contentment and absolute confidence so that pain and death stand no chance of being in their way, that death and pain do not take away the power of being in a relationship with a God who holds us in his hands and who bathes us in his affection and who gives us his grace, so that with every painful memory, he provides healing. For every moment of guilt of the past, he provides forgiveness and mercy. For every doubt and despair that emerges from us, that he provides hope and resolve and purpose for the future. I never would have thought to have experienced the power of a God who is greater than the things that I dreaded. And yet I did. I never would have thought that out of those dark days would come what has been for me one of my greatest gifts. We're a very loud world filled with all kinds of distraction and noise. The season of Advent invites us to step aside and to invite the silence and to invite the questions, to be able to feel and experience the touch of God as he brings to us things that we thought were beyond our grasp, to invite the presence of silence. It was in 2010 that there was a movement among users of Facebook to name John Cage's 433 as the #1 pop single in anticipation of Christmas and the season of Advent. I mean, their idea was they were going to force radio stations to play the 433 so that with all of the other kind of claptrap, happy clappy music that was on the radio stations, there would be 4 minutes and 33 seconds of quiet insanity every once in a while. They didn't get the #1 spot, but they did get number 21. And so the opportunity for us as people of faith who yearn for the touch of God to create spaces of silence in the midst of all of the hubbub, in the midst of all of the fear that we try to distract ourselves from, of the coronavirus and all the regrets of the things that we can't do, to invite moments of sanity into our lives so that the God who loves us can touch us, heal us, and embolden us for the future and to meet the challenges that await us. So, it's the gift. It is the gift of the season of Advent and the opportunity to experience the touch of the God who made us. So let's stand.